tonight, our topic is Toughing It Out in Afghanistan, with the interesting subtitle of Current Prospects and Future Projects, the subtitle being every bit as rich as the title proper. All of us are worried about the prospects, and we're curious about what projects might be helpful. Everyone is pained by the cost of the enterprise. And the other side of the coin, the reasons and justifications for doing it become extraordinarily interesting. And then the prospects of making it all work is a complex calculus, of course. And Dr. O'Hanlon has been looking at these things long and hard. He runs the indices that Brookings produces on Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, an approach to have quantitative measures of what is happening and trends. And he's been the head honcho of that for a long time. He also is the head or primary analyst for American foreign policy at Brookings. He's been one of the advisors to both Petraeus and McChrystal in the development of their strategies, and he's been on the advisory committee of the Secretary of State for International Matters. So he's looking, and he's certainly been to the area often. So he has practical experience with it, he's observed it, he's talked to the right people, and he's discussed these matters with people at the most senior levels. As nearly all of you know also from previous engagements here, he's a graduate of Princeton, where he now also is a visiting professor. His degrees, his Bachelor of Arts degree, and I believe both of your master's degrees were in the physical sciences. So he brings an orientation and background which is a little different from people doing the kind of work he's doing now, but they're most helpful as he looks at the technical aspects of these matters. And of course his PhD is in international studies at Princeton. He's, after getting his BA, he was in the Peace Corps, which I think in the Congo, which is interesting. He has worked at the Institute for Policy Analyses on the strategic level. He's done strategic analysis at the Congressional Budget Office, all before he joined Brookings in the mid-90s. At Brookings, he's the author or co-author or shared author of at least 8 books, and there may be more. His expertise is the national security area in general, and he's studied almost every facet of it, from the level of strategy to the technical questions of space and other matters. He's, as I've said before, written a book on North Korea, nuclear weapons, and he's looked hard at the Chinese problems, especially as it relates to Taiwan. So in short, he's done a lot in the area. Nearly all of you know him from one of his op-ed pieces. He's written over 200 of those, and he's appeared on television and radio since 9/11 probably 2,000 times. So you probably haven't missed Michael O'Hanlon, and you'll be sorry if you've missed him tonight, and you haven't. And those who are not with us will be disappointed, I know. I'm looking forward to the presentation very much. It's an enormous pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael O'Hanlon.
Thank you all. It's a real treat to be here. And I also want to let you know, and I'm sure it will take no reminder for this crowd, but Frank hasn't lost a thing in terms of his diplomatic touch and his ability to make things happen. We were speaking last night as I was landing at LaGuardia at about 6 p.m. And by the way, the saga turned out to be not too terrible, but it's true I didn't get home till 1 a.m. And I had my 7-year-old daughter walking the last 20 minutes of it with me in the snow without winter gear. So I'm definitely well on my track for Worst Daddy of the Year award. But as we were landing in LaGuardia, before all that, I talked to Frank on the phone, and he said, Mike, do what you want. I want you to be comfortable. I want you to be safe. I don't want you to put undue pressure on yourself if you can't make it. just let me know. But I would point out that this would be the first time in about the 300-year history of the Baltimore Council that we had to cancel an event. And so, you know, and I wouldn't want that to be, you know, a Washingtonian who happened to be the one to first make this mistake. And especially what, you know, do I have to go on and remind people of what football issues have come to in this day and age as well, where we Baltimore folks are always either in the Super Bowl or one of our progeny from years gone by is in the Super Bowl, and you're down there struggling to make 500. So, as you know, it was a pretty powerful speech. Some of that he implied more than said, but that was pretty much the message, and it worked. But the main reason I wanted to come was that I really admire this council, and I've been thrilled and privileged to be here before, as he said, I think twice before on different topics, and the energy of this place is really stunning. In my travels around the country and various speaking engagement, there's only one place that really rivals this, and that's Naples, Florida, and they have a little easier issue with weather, especially these days. So just in terms of the amount of energy, the amount of passion, the amount of expertise, I really enjoy speaking here. So I do want to treat this almost like a large group seminar in the sense that I'd like to make sure I get my remarks done quickly enough that we have plenty of time for discussion, because there's plenty to talk about. And I'm trying to feel my way on Afghanistan like I'm sure many of you are as well. I had a great privilege in writing this short book, which was supposed to be here tonight, and UPS did make it, by the way, into my back streets in Bethesda, but did not make it somehow from one part of downtown Baltimore to another, so the book's not here. You can still buy it. But in any event, I'll give you a little bit of a flavor for it. The privilege I had was writing it with this woman, Hasina Sherjan, who is sort of like a kite runner story. She is just an impressive person. She's from a big Afghanistan traditional political family. They had to leave in the 70s during all the violence and the coups. They settled in Florida. She grew up part of her childhood there, and then started getting the desire to help her home country in the mid-90s. And when the Taliban were still in power in Afghanistan, she bought herself a plane ticket, bought herself a burqa, and went over and met with the Vice Minister of Education to ask for permission to start a girls' school, a school for young females' education. And of course, the answer was no, and so she did it anyway. And she did it largely, as you'll understand, in the northern part of the country, in and around the Panjshir Valley, where the Northern Alliance was in control, and so she didn't have to worry about the Taliban immediately threatening her enterprise. But that's what she started to do in the late 90s. And then after the overthrow of the Taliban in 2001, she moved back. And not only does she still run this girls' education NGO, but she also runs a business. So she understands a little bit about what it's going to take to get Afghanistan on its feet. And she's a very savvy politics person as well, and understanding where things stand with the Karzai government, with various other players. And so I was very privileged to meet her really just in 2008. And we quickly decided this book project would make sense, because I wanted to talk about the military and strategic reasons for why I thought Afghanistan was important and why I thought the approach we were taking could work. And she very much desperately wants it to work. I'm going to be a little bit more systematic here in my presentation in just a second, but let me just say, for those of you who know Afghans or who have had the pleasure of interacting with them, make no mistake, they want this basic concept, this basic thing we're trying to do to work. There isn't a lot of doubt about this. This is a country that knows what civil war does to a land and to a people, and knows what the Taliban does to a land and a people. There is not a great deal of division about the basic idea of whether or not people want this experiment in democracy, however flawed, using international assistance for whatever time is needed, however imperfect, to succeed or not. They desperately want this to work. They live in fear of renewed anarchy. They live in fear of a resurgence of the Taliban, which of course was happening at least through 2006, 7, 8, and part of 2009. By the way, I think that stopped, so I'll give you a little bit of my hand early on. Not only do I think this mission is doable, I think it's starting to work. It's too early to say with any great confidence that it's working. There are a lot of things that could still go wrong, but I think we're starting to see things go in the right direction. And this is not because she's, by the way, a big fan of Karzai or anybody else. She is very critical of the political class in her country, and we try to put some pressure on them in the book, like many other people have been doing. although we have to find that right tone, and we've been watching the Obama administration struggle to find the right tone here as Vice President Biden and Ambassador Holbrooke and Ambassador Eikenberry, the U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, have all been publicly critical of President Karzai and his regime, very harshly critical at times, to the point where we were actually at risk of perhaps overplaying our hand, getting to the point where we couldn't work with him as closely as possible. And you've seen a bit of a walking back of that. You've seen a bit of, for example, Hillary Clinton, when she went to Karzai's second inaugural in November, trying to acknowledge that he had done some good things for his country and did have some strengths. You know, you mentioned Congo, where I was a Peace Corps volunteer, privileged to be in that country in the early 80s. But no Congolese, then called Zairians, were privileged to have Mobutu Sese Seko as their leader. Karzai is no Mobutu. He's a much better person. He has his great flaws, and again, I'm sort of now working my way into the main structure of the talk, but he has his many flaws. But let's remember also that in a sense, what his flaws are today, and they're serious, are the same character traits that we saw as virtues back in 01, 02 when we helped choose him as president. To remind you of the history, after the overthrow of the Taliban, there was a big Bonn conference in Germany where the international community, with Afghan advice and participation, chose Karzai and designated him as an interim president. And he was then elected in 2004 for the first time in an election that had high turnout and gave him a fairly strong mandate. Then, of course, as you know, he was reelected in the very disputed, less high turnout election of 2009, and I had the privilege of being an election observer, and I'll come back to that in just a second. But there's no doubt that the same kinds of attributes of Karzai that initially made him appealing are now also becoming limitations on his effectiveness. He is a big tent guy. He likes to be forgiving. He likes to be inclusive. He likes to ask people to turn the other leaf. Now, you can go too far with this strategy. You can bring in people who are fundamentally corrupt. You can help your own family members too much. You can allow your own tribe to be seen as the primary beneficiary of the new country, new government, new effort that's being undertaken, and thereby antagonize and anger the other tribes, which become good recruiting ground for the Taliban. Karzai's made a lot of mistakes, but he has also done some of the things we wanted him to do back in 01, 02. In any event, he's no Mobutu. He is no kleptocrat. He himself, I don't believe, is fundamentally a corrupt person. He has a lot of corrupt friends, and he makes a lot of weak decisions. But that's my take on Karzai. And I think he's the kind of guy we're going to have to be able to work with, and I think we can work with him. My own view is, having studied Iraq a bit too, on balance, if I had to spend a lot of time with the leader of one country or another, I would choose Karzai over Maliki in a second. If I had to guess which one's more effective for their country, I think it's still up for grabs. So I think you're dealing at roughly that level of competence of leadership, however we measure these things, and that's just a very, rough gut general assessment. Let me now give you a few, what I want to do now with the 20 minutes or so that I'm going to speak, 20, 25 minutes, I want to tell you a couple of things I saw in my trips recently to Afghanistan, and these are not intended to portray myself as some expert on the country. Frank had it right. I'm a general national security person, and whenever I write one of these books on Korea or Afghanistan, I try to team up with somebody who knows the country so that we cover that area, effectively, not through my expertise, but through theirs, and then try to see if bringing a national security perspective plus a local perspective can work synergistically. So I'm just going to give you a few impressions. And I think they begin to map out the story a little bit of where Afghanistan is today. Then I want to talk a little bit about the two big reasons I'm optimistic, and then also talk about three worries that people often have, three concerns people have about Afghanistan, and why I take those seriously, but also think we can probably overcome them well enough to achieve our core objectives. So let me now do those things. But by way of transition, when I say well enough to achieve our core objectives, or well enough to achieve a reasonable victory, what I mean by this, I think, is fairly straightforward. And I know there's a lot of diplomatic and intelligence community and national security community expertise in this room, from people's careers and people's past interests. I think the gut instinct on what it means to be successful is to put Afghanistan in a position where the Taliban don't take over the country again, Pakistan is not destabilized from Afghan soil, the Afghan government can increasingly control its own territory with less help from us, so that we can leave and the place doesn't fall apart, and that it gradually continues to improve with time at whatever pace it is able. That's my definition of success. I think it's a fairly modest definition, but I think it's adequate. It's adequate for us in our core strategic interests, and I think it's adequate for Hasina and her Afghan counterparts and compatriots, all of whom would obviously prefer the best possible life they can have for themselves and their children as soon as possible, but they're also realistic. And in fact, I'll come back to this in just a second when I talk about the two reasons I'm optimistic. But Afghans are themselves optimistic, and they're patient. And this is actually in some contrast to some of our friends in the Middle East. Iraqis, for example, not always known for being all that optimistic or all that grateful about any positive trends they saw in their lives. And on top of that, by the way, when we invaded Iraq, we actually made things worse for a while, not better. In Afghanistan, they have been certainly difficult, but better than they had been. And that's another virtue, another thing that works to our advantage. Okay, let me begin with a couple of anecdotes, though, just to give you a little bit of a scene as I see Afghanistan. When I was there in August, and it was my second trip at that time, I was there with one of the agencies or independent groups monitoring the Afghan elections. And I saw two things in the course of those elections that really struck me, one good and one bad. The good news was that the level of performance of government officials throughout that process that I witnessed, at least, was pretty solid. The election workers knew what they were doing. The police actually seemed to be guarding the place pretty well. The Army, which is thought of as somewhat better than the police in Afghanistan, did also a good job at outer perimeter security. We didn't have to depend on, or didn't even see, a lot of NATO forces in the streets that day doing the monitoring that we were doing. I was in Kabul, so it's not particularly difficult as an environment, except that the forces that wanted to stop the election or interfere with it knew full well that Kabul was a good place to try to do that. And so there were reports of up to 15 cars with possible explosives in them roaming the city streets. And it was a bit of a tense day to be out and about. But nonetheless, the security forces did a good job. And when I went over to ISAF headquarters 2 days later and saw the morning briefing that General McChrystal was nice enough to let me sit in on, I saw that there had been 400 incidents that day nationwide, 400 violent incidents throughout Afghanistan on election day, but only about 20 fatalities, which is a fairly decent performance by the security forces. Now, that's not the whole story. Obviously, the Taliban in Afghanistan are smart enough not to do the big car bombings that al-Qaeda in Iraq has often done, because they realize that polarizes the population away from them, pushes the population away. So unfortunately, there's some bad news in this statistic as well. But overall, the Afghan security forces and election workers did a pretty good job. That's the good news. The bad news, terrible turnout. Just terrible. I mean, we were out by about 9 a.m. There were still some people voting at 9 a.m., not too many. By 10, 11, 12, hardly anybody. And all day, virtually no women, even in Kabul, which, as you know, is a relatively cosmopolitan, relatively safer part of the country compared to the south and the east, where ultimately a lot of the fraud was uncovered. And by the way, in the same vein, let me just quickly make an observation. There was also, I thought, good news and bad news in the way the election process played out over the next 3 months, where you had Karzai's cronies essentially trying to stuff the ballot box for him in a lot of the south and the east, but ultimately the independent election monitoring groups stopping that. And it was a tainted process, to be sure, but they threw away 1 million ballots, and that was allowed. No one, now we had a hand in making sure it was allowed, but no one managed to find a way to keep those 1 million ballots in the count. And Karzai had to ultimately be willing to accept a second round of voting. In the end, that didn't happen because his opponent conceded. But I think the process had both a good and a bad side. Glass about 50% full. On the one hand, the election process found all those fraudulent ballots and dismissed them. On the other hand, a lot of people were trying to cheat, and the ultimate outcome was seen as somewhat tainted. I'll come back to that in a second, too. But again, the election process, on balance, not too bad, but not too good. I went back in November, just spent about a week with the military there, and I had the great honor of going to Helmand Province, where, as you know, we took a lot of the casualties last summer, where, as we speak today, we're about to take a lot more, because General McChrystal and his commanders have been advertising for all the world to see that we are about to attack Marja, the main remaining town in the central part of the Helmand River Valley. There may even be people here, for all I know, who worked in Helmand in earlier eras. Apparently, there are still Afghans in the Helmand River Valley who remember Americans from the good old days of the 50s and 60s and 70s by name, and will come up to Americans who are now returning there and say, "Do you know Mr. Bob?" So who's Mr. Bob? Well, he helped me a lot, and they built this canal over here in 1962 or in whatever the year it might be. So there's a certain amount of pro-Americanism, and again, I'll come back to that. But we are now in Helmand and in Kandahar and in other key strategic areas of the south and east. And when I went to visit, I spoke with General Nicholson. It's confusing, by the way, if you follow Afghanistan policy. There are two Brigadier General Nicholsons, who are two of our top 5 military commanders in the country in terms of their expertise and their ability. So there's one who's now at the Pentagon, and he goes by Mick Nicholson as his name. And then there's Larry Nicholson. And Mick is an Army general, and Larry is a Marine general, and they're both brilliant, and they both know Afghanistan well, and they're both having a lot of success. And so my anecdotes from November come from General Nicholson, and what he said and showed us were a couple of things. One, he said, we now have Marines patrolling in central Helmand province in the town of Nawa and other towns along the river without their body armor. They are that accepted by the population. And we took a lot of casualties to get to that point. But General Nicholson said, I want them patrolling without their body armor because I want them to be accessible. And if we can get away with it, we're going to keep it up. Now, what's about to happen in Marja will involve body armor. But nonetheless, we are seeing a level of acceptance by the population that is somewhat evocative of what happened in Iraq towards the 6 to 9 month period of the surge. So the local population is welcoming people. He also talked about how Pashtun tribal leaders, and as you know, the Pashtun are the majority, well, not quite the majority, they're the largest ethnic group in Afghanistan, about 45% of the population, and they predominate in the south and the east, and they are pretty much the only source of recruits for the Taliban. So they are the critical population. And the Pashtun tribal leaders in the Helmand River Valley belt are now coming up to General Nicholson and asking, can I have 20 of my tribes or communities' young men join the police and work with you and be trained by you? This never happened before, when it was just the Brits and then a dabbling of Marines or a few Americans passing through. We didn't get this kind of help from Pashtun tribal leaders. They were very mistrustful. They were also fearful. Let me quote, if I could, from a different Pashtun tribal leader, this one in Uruzgan province, which is just north of Kandahar city, a little bit inland, a little bit in the interior, and it's where the Dutch are based with the Australians. And the Dutch produced this wonderful report that I would recommend to anybody who wants a nice 30-page summary of the challenges of one key province in Afghanistan. And what they did was they quoted this Pashtun tribal leader, this was about a year ago, who was interviewed, and they asked him, who are you supporting in the war, the government or the Taliban? And he said, well, of course, I have half of my young men on each side. And they said, well, why? Haven't you made up your mind who you want to win yet? It's just like splitting your bets for the Super Bowl or something because your heart's divided. And he said, no, I know who I want to win. I just don't know who will win. And I have to be on the winning side. And Afghans are like that. They are smart. They are very, very attentive to battlefield trends and to what's going to shape their personal security environment. Now, this is, therefore, bad news if the Taliban has momentum psychologically and perceptually, because it suggests people will keep dividing their loyalties. But it's good news if you start to establish your own momentum and a sense of real commitment, because then people may take your side. especially if the local security forces, the Afghans themselves, start to be dependable and trustworthy. Okay, so those are some of the anecdotes. Now let me try to organize some of those concepts into a couple of key reasons for success, key reasons for hope about success and its prospects, and then address these three worries that I think, you know, are probably similar to some of the worries on your mind, and I'll see if I can assuage any of your potential concerns without in any way claiming that the case is closed even in my own head, because this one could still go either way. But two reasons why I think the odds are with us to achieve that modest level of success that I mentioned, and then a gradual exit strategy, let's say over the next 3 to 5 years. Not so much by July 2011, we can come back to that, the date President Obama gave as the beginning of the drawdown, but more to 2012-13, where I think the drawdown can really accelerate if the strategy works as intended. Reason number one for success, and I've hinted at it, alluded to it, let me just say it, the Afghans want it to work. When I say the Afghans, I don't mean everyone, obviously. There are certain disaffected tribes, there are certain corrupt individuals, there are certain extremist leaders who very much want the strategy to fail, want the country to fall back into either anarchy or into Taliban control. But most Afghans have no doubt about their loyalty, and even within individual sectarian groups, there is no major sectarian group that wants the strategy to fail. This is in stark contrast to Iraq, where for much of the first 3 years, the Sunni wanted us to lose. In fact, as you recall, I think we've discussed it here, certainly with me and with other speakers, I'm sure, and yourselves, 90% of Sunni Iraqis felt that it was okay to kill Americans through 04, 05, 90%. They wanted us to lose, and they wanted us to hurt in the process. You don't see that among Afghan attitudes. This is one of the more pro-American countries in the broader Central Command, Middle Eastern region. Define it as you like. The last poll I saw that was just a straight up-down on favorability towards Americans, the numbers were between 40 and 60%. Now, not wonderful, but not horrible, and certainly much better than having 90% of the population wanting to kill you, which is the way we dealt with things back in Iraq, with the situation that we faced. But more importantly than how they feel about us, I think, is how they feel about the Taliban and their government. About the Taliban, about the best thing they can say is what that tribal leader from Uruzgan said, which is, we don't know yet if they're going to lose, so we can't afford to make them too upset. We are survivors. We know how to, put our finger in the wind and see how things are going. Until we're sure things are going to work out okay, we've got to be a little bit unclear in our loyalties, a little bit divided in our commitment to the government. But 90 to 95% of Afghans always say they don't like the Taliban in polling. Now, they're probably, there are always uncertainties in any kind of survey, and certainly in this kind of a public opinion polling, but it's uniform throughout all of the ones I've ever seen done. And even in Kandahar City, which is sort of the heart of conservative Pashtun culture and the heart of the Taliban movement, the popularity of the Taliban does not exceed 25%. Now that's worrisome because it's greater than it used to be. And that's part of why I sort of half believe these polls. They sort of track with what I think I've seen over the last few years. And they are more disturbing in areas like Kandahar than in other areas. But generally speaking, nationwide, less than 10% popularity for the Taliban, and even in Kandahar City, 25%. I talked to you before about Karzai and his election and his difficulties therein. But let me quote from you, or quote for you from a couple of recent surveys that were done in late 2009, after the outcome of the election was determined, after former Foreign Minister Abdullah withdrew his name, alleging that the amount of fraud was just too great and that Karzai was not being forthcoming in his willingness to accept proteges of Abdullah into government. So the way the Afghans responded was to say, okay, yes, we know that there were a lot of problems in the election. And there were questions, do you think that there were serious irregularities in the national elections of August 20th? And 65% of all Afghans said yes, there were serious problems. By the way, 80% of them also say corruption's a big problem. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. But 65% said yes, there were big problems. 55% said by the way, I didn't vote for Karzai. I voted for either Abdullah or Brookings non-resident senior fellow Ashraf Ghani, or one of the other many candidates. There were 41, I believe, in the end. But these numbers sort of tracked because that's actually, in fact, the percentage that Karzai got was about 45%. 55%, in fact, did vote for someone else. So the polls seem to be, at least roughly consistent with reality. But then they asked people, do you accept Karzai as the legitimately elected leader of your country? And about 70% said yes, even though they had said the elections were very tainted. Now, that may sound paradoxical. On the other hand, I think in the United States even we can appreciate that we know some of our politicians have ethical issues or have political machines that aren't totally savory and don't always play by the rules, and yet we still may, in the end, forgive a certain amount of that if the leader delivers, or if the leader seems like it's the best we're going to get anyway, and we might as well try to work with this person. And then it gets even better, in a sense, because the next question, by the way, one of these polls was done by ABC and BBC, and the other was done by International Republican Institute. Those are the two polls I'm quoting from. And Frank kindly mentioned our Afghanistan index. If you want a summary version, it's there, or you can just Google these polls. But they're very interesting. The next question was, do you like Karzai? Okay, so 70% said that they accepted him as the legitimate quasi-elected leader of their country. 80% said they basically like him. So again, whatever Ambassador Eikenberry, Ambassador Holbrooke, and Vice President Biden think on their most angry days about Karzai, and I understand why they get angry, the Afghan people think this is a fundamentally decent person to have as their president, or maybe decent's a little optimistic because they know there's a lot of corruption, but they also see a guy who's trying to lead the country together. And again, these polls are done in different ways. You might have to worry, well, are people telling pollsters what the pollsters want to hear? There are a lot of reasons why the actual absolute number may not be absolutely trustworthy. But the interesting thing about polls in Afghanistan is that over the years, they sort of track what common sense tells you as well. Because one last thing would be, the United States and NATO are now back up, as I mentioned before, to 50% popularity, more or less. In 2006, 2007, 2008, however, our numbers were more like 30%, 35%. It was slipping as the situation was starting to slip away, as the security environment was starting to deteriorate. And so again, you see a situation where common sense seems to reinforce what you hear in the polls. I don't want to make too much of them even so, but the bottom line is that Afghans don't see a better choice. And there really isn't, I don't think, a better choice right now for Afghanistan than Hamid Karzai. There are also some good people he's appointed into the cabinet. And we don't talk about this enough because we want to put pressure on him to get rid of the bums, and there's still plenty of bums around too. But Minister of Interior Atmar, Minister of Defense Wardak, the Minister of Finance, a couple of the other key ministers for a country with the challenges of Afghanistan are widely considered some of the better government ministers and reasonably solid. And for those of you who follow Afghanistan, you'll, I'm sure, recall about a month and a half ago, the Afghan parliament rejected 2/3 of President Karzai's initial list for new cabinet ministers in his second term. But you know what? The ones they accepted, the ones the parliament accepted, were those good ones. So the newspapers, I think American newspaper reporting is pretty good overall. I'm not a big media basher, but still, this story was portrayed a little too negatively. It was as if, well, okay, this is a breakdown in Afghan democracy. Because in the United States, we always tend to approve our ministers pretty fast, and if there's even one who gets voted down, it's a little bit of a scandal, or if one person has to withdraw their name, that's a bad thing. And here in Afghanistan, 2/3 of the initial proposals were voted down. Well, the system sort of worked. And then a couple weeks later, Karzai came back and he proposed additional new ministers, and about 7 more were approved. And that was a cumulative process, which meant that we had 2/3 of the ministries now full. But again, the media portrayed this as, again, 7 more people voted down, as if somehow the Afghan government was empty of office holders during this period. In fact, it's a very weak government. I'm coming to that in just a second, and it has a lot of problems, but the democratic system was sort of working, and the Afghan people look at that, they see that, they like that, and they remember the alternative, which is the Haqqani network or the Hezbollah Islami, group or the Taliban, and they say, you know, Karzai is not that bad compared to what we might otherwise have. So that's one big strength. And the other big strength, and I'll be very brief on this because we talk about it a lot in the United States, but it still can't quite be said often enough, is the basic strength of the U.S. military at now doing this kind of thing. And I believe, and with apologies to people of the Vietnam generation, of the people who had an involvement in that war, there were a lot of obviously extremely brave Americans who did wonderful service for their country in that war. And I'm going to be a little bit blunt, however, and say the quality of leadership in the Vietnam War, to my mind, was nothing like what we have today, either in the military or in the Joint Chiefs of Staff and in other parts of the top national security establishment. People understand counterinsurgency. They understand the importance of protecting the population, of giving the Afghans the right to make the decisions, whether they're good or bad decisions at first, of trying to work patiently through a process that allows for a gradual betterment of the quality of Afghan leadership. And again, we all know people in the military. I continue to be extremely impressed not only by their valor and their bravery, and the IED threat is a particularly pernicious and scary one to have to deal with, but by their amazing ability to do this complex mission. Now, it hasn't always been this way even in Afghanistan, of course, and it took us a while to put our best people in charge to devote full resources to this war. Major General Michael Flynn, who, as you know, is the head of intelligence in Afghanistan, just wrote a paper last month talking about how we still have to fix the intelligence gathering process because we focus too much on the enemy and not enough on the tribes that we need to work with to build up a functioning civil society and local government structure. So we still have a long ways to go. But the basic understanding of how to do counterinsurgency has never been better in the U.S. military. In fact, I'm not sure it's ever even been close. And as one indication of the rapid improvement in our execution of the strategy that I bet you know, hasn't been widely perceived, and some of you may not have seen this data because it hasn't been that widely discussed. When General McChrystal took command last June and said we have to minimize the use of large caliber weaponry and large ordnance air power explosives in order to protect the civilian population, we have seen an immediate and substantial improvement in reducing the number of fatalities that we cause. And so in 2008, the estimate was that NATO air power killed at least 800 Afghans inadvertently. And in 2009, the estimate was 600. We can come back to your concerns in the discussion, because I'll tell you one thing, McChrystal is not happy either. McChrystal would still say 600 is way too many. But compare this to Vietnam. In Vietnam, we probably were inadvertently killing tens of thousands of Vietnamese a year. Tens of thousands. Now McChrystal has already reduced the number of Afghan fatalities by 25% for the whole year. He was just in command for half the year. And the number is much, much lower. And you're starting to see, therefore, a greater Afghan acceptance of NATO forces, greater ability to work with us, willingness to work with us. So the Afghans want this thing to work. We're pretty good at doing what we're doing, at least in terms of security. And the synergy of getting the Afghans and NATO to work together is therefore primed for a lot of progress. Three very quick things, and I'll tick these off fast to get to discussion, because there are very valid concerns and reasons for worry. One, corruption. I think it's still a very, very big problem in Afghanistan. I'll just say two quick things about why I'm somewhat hopeful that our new strategy and approach is going to mitigate the pernicious effects of corruption. One is that the strategy for addressing this now, that I've heard several NATO officials talk to me about, strikes me as realistic. No one is saying we got to stop, just stamp out corruption, get every bad guy fired. Anybody who's taking a dollar on the side needs to be out of office tomorrow. If you say that, heck, you say that in certain parts of the United States, you're not going to be realistic. You certainly can't do that in Afghanistan, where salaries have been so low for so long, where there's such a culture of this. What they're trying to do is to dilute the influence of corrupt individuals by bringing them into, you know, some traditional Afghan decision-making structures that involve a higher percentage of good guys and gals, mostly guys, given Afghanistan's conservative traditions. But nonetheless, they're trying to bring in a broader range of people into shuras, into other kinds of meetings, into parliament, to the extent that the Afghan leadership and NATO have any influence on that, and trying to basically dilute and weaken the impact of the particularly nefarious, corrupt individuals. Now, yes, we're putting pressure on Karzai to do something about the worst of the worst. But what we're doing now, instead of having officials walk up to Karzai and say, you got to fire these 4 people, we walk up to him and say, by the way, here's some portfolios, some intelligence dossiers that we've been compiling on these 4. I don't think you would accuse us of fabricating these communications intercepts. We're giving you the raw data. We hope it's useful to you. We know full well you'll want to do something about it. In other words, a little more indirect. It's not always going to work, but it sure goes over better with Karzai than us walking in and telling him who to fire from his own government. And so that's a fundamental reason why I think anti-corruption efforts have a better chance than they did before. The other reason is because we now have the ability to work locally with the police and the Army through McChrystal's approach to partnering. We have a lot more NATO forces on the ground. We're patrolling with them, with the Afghans, together every day. We're working with them. We're training with them. We are planning with them. And we see who the good leaders are and who the good leaders are not. And we take that information and we go to Minister of Interior Atmar, Minister of Defense Wardak, and we say, Mr. Minister, here are some intelligence portfolios and dossiers on these 17 leaders. Some of them are a little problematic. I'm sure you'll want to do something about it. And we don't say you have to fire these 6 guys. That's not our right or our responsibility per se. But we can let these ministers know which local officials are basically trying to do their jobs correctly, which ones need a little bit of cajoling and further education, and which ones are just flat out corrupt. And this process is beginning to work. And we saw it work in Iraq in 2007 with the reform of the national police, which happened very fast once we had the right leadership in place in Iraq. I think there are reasons to believe it's going to happen now in Afghanistan. McChrystal's focus on partnering is going to provide us the information we need to help Wardak and Atmar and others make these decisions. So that's reason 1, or issue 1, corruption. Capacity is another issue. Capacity of the Afghan government to do economic development. This is probably the one I have the least good answer for. This is way behind the curve. There is not nearly enough Afghan civilian structure to really beef up the economy, make the overall strategy of job creation and economic revitalization work at the local level. This one's going to be long and slow. The main good news here is that the Afghans themselves are realistic about what can be accomplished on any time frame. And I do think job creation has to accelerate. Most other things, however, I think actually the Afghans are prepared to accept gradual improvement. And in some areas, they've already had astronomical improvement. There are 7 million kids in school now, compared to less than 1 million under the Taliban. You know, there's 6 million cell phones in Afghanistan. Inoculations are now reaching 60, 70% of the kids. So there's a long ways to go. But Afghans are aware that the economic side of the strategy is in some sense the weakest, but it's also in some sense where they have the most modest expectations, because they remember that the alternative is not, you know, some good old day where life was easy, but was the anarchy or civil war of the 80s and 90s. And I think that's one of the reasons why they are a little bit more patient on this issue of economic capacity building than you might expect. Last thing, and I'll stop here, and it's also very troublesome, I don't have a perfect answer either, but the Pakistani dimension, the sanctuary for the Afghan leadership in Quetta, in Baluchistan, and also along the tribal areas that we all read about, that we're all getting used to saying Waziristan as if we're native speakers. You know, this is one of the more frequent terms. I probably say Waziristan more often than I say Idaho in daily conversation these days, and I bet that's true for a lot of you as well. But nonetheless, these sanctuaries are very important. They're very troublesome. We're going to do a book launch next week in Doha, Qatar, with a former head of the Pakistani ISI, and it's going to be a fun book event to talk about Pakistan and Afghanistan together with someone like that as well, because as you know, there have been some sympathies in certain parts of the Pakistani military for the Taliban. This has been a big problem for us. I can only say 2 or 3 things to mitigate this worry. I cannot address it fully the way I would like to. But mitigating issue number 1, or mitigating dimension of this number 1, is that McChrystal and Flynn, General Flynn, who I mentioned before, have ascertained that almost all the actual fighters for the resistance in Afghanistan are Afghan. In other words, there is not that much cross-border movement to the extent that we thought before by most of the rank-and-file fighters. So if you can make the strategy work on its own local terms in Afghanistan, while the leadership being over in Pakistan is a problem, it is not necessarily going to be able to revitalize the ranks of the, of the foot soldier for the insurgency, to the degree that we once feared. So that's mitigating condition number one. Mitigating condition number two is that we're starting to see a little greater commonality of purpose among Pakistan and the United States. I don't want to oversell this, but we are getting pretty good at killing a lot of their bad guys for them. And that's not always a good thing, but we've also gotten better at reducing the civilian fatalities from the drone attacks. They don't like to talk about this. We don't like to talk about it a lot, but it's an important dimension of defeating a ruthless enemy in this kind of a struggle. And we've seen now 2 of the Masouds killed in the last 6 months, apparently, by these drone attacks. And the Pakistanis, they might not always say it, they do appreciate it. And we appreciate that we're getting somewhat better intelligence on certain resistance groups from them. There are still some big disagreements, but we are seeing a gradual convergence of interest among 2 partners that have, over the years, as you know, been hot and cold with each other, to the point where a certain amount of mistrust is going to be very deep and very hard to dispel. And we're going to have to be patient at rebuilding relationships that we did not really do much to foster over the 1990s and the earlier part of the 21st century. So those are a couple of reasons why I think the Pakistan dimension, while still very worrisome, is not going to be, in my judgment, it's not going to be enough of a problem to cause us defeat unless the other things, other aspects of the strategy also fail. The Pakistan problem is big, but I actually think that we're on a trajectory where we're minimizing it, or at least reducing it, and that may be enough to at least allow us to cement the positive momentum. And once you get that positive momentum entrenched in people's minds, and you pour in a lot of resources, and you build up the Afghan army and police, and you give them high enough salary that people want to stay with the Afghan army and police instead of switching over to the Taliban, then you begin to have the makings for building that kind of momentum that the tribal leader in Uruzgan province would understand. Because he's a survivor, most Afghans are survivors. If we convey the sense that we're committed and that we're helping the Afghans create the capacity to ultimately hold this thing together on their own in 3 or 4 years as we downsize, I think we're going to get probably a snowballing effect where all of a sudden things start to escalate. And the final sentence, this may be the reason why General McChrystal is starting to smile a little more. And if you read carefully the press about McChrystal and the Afghan war in general, you will know that this is a much happier man than he was 6 months ago. He doesn't like to talk in those terms because he is still distressed about civilian fatalities. He's still aware of all the things that could go wrong. He still knows how much further we have to get. But there's a sense that the tide is turning. And I think there's also a real possibility that as it begins to turn, it could accelerate in the right direction. So obviously that's what I hope and pray. I look forward to your reactions, rebuttals, comments, questions. Thanks.
Well, appreciate so much packing as much as you did into the short time that we have. Floor is open for questions. Those 2 parts are 2 big questions.
Yeah.
The second, of course, is what is the difference between the current leadership in Afghanistan and Abrams and Westmoreland? And secondly, does the American taxpayer have to nation build in Afghanistan?
Great questions. I would say on the issue of military leadership, I agree that the strategic Hamlet concept was a good one, but I think it was applied in a very uneven way. And you had certain aspects of the Afghanistan war that even in 03, 04, 05, we had pockets of strategic Hamletry. We weren't doing it in a comprehensive fashion, however. And that's why when McChrystal went in last June, even though Obama had already approved one big troop increase, McChrystal said, I want to do this comprehensively. I don't want to be in good control of Nawa, but 10 miles away have Marja be a sanctuary for the Taliban, because that smacks too much of doing this in a manner that allows for one strategic hamlet here and one enemy sanctuary there. We had a little bit too much of that in Vietnam because, as you well know, the Marines and the Army did not have the same approach in Vietnam, and the Marines themselves evolved over time. So I don't think the execution was very well enforced or organized in Vietnam. And I also think the use of offensive firepower, with all due respect, was horribly excessive in Vietnam because we did not. I teach courses on methods of defense analysis, and one of the things we talk about is the use of metrics and these Afghanistan and Iraq indices and all this. And as you know, one of the metrics that we had in Vietnam, for those who believed in strategic hamlets, was the number of local inhabitants protected. That's a good metric. But most of the military was using the metric of body counts. That's a bad metric, especially when you can't tell who you just killed. And you have an incentive to try to kill more, even when you don't really know who you're killing. So again, I don't fault the people carrying out the policy, but I think the leadership in Vietnam, overall, without commenting on individuals, was somewhere between mediocre and poor in terms of what this kind of a war requires and what we got. That's my take. You lived it. I studied it as an historical issue. There's plenty more we could discuss, but that to me is the distinction. I think McChrystal said to himself and to the country, it's not good enough for me to have a few nice ideas here and there. We got to do this comprehensively throughout at least the South and East, the core of the Pashtun tribal belt, the core of the economy, or we're going to be ineffective. And that for him was one of the lessons of Vietnam. And I think he was willing to say, I owe it to the men and women in uniform and to the Afghan people to be very blunt about the requirements to do the strategy right. And even though Obama gave a good initial troop request under General McKiernan, it's not enough to really do the strategic hamlet concept comprehensively. That'd be I know there are a million things you could say in reply, and I'd love to discuss this with you maybe later. On the issue of nation building, I think the simple answer that I would put forth is this. We tried your straightforward approach, and with all due fairness to Secretary Rumsfeld, at that time, the idea of a light footprint, don't try to nation build Afghanistan, don't try to be a big foreign presence, just do what's required for U.S. national security. There was a certain logic to that back in 01, 02, 03, 04, 05. What we know now that he didn't know then is that it doesn't work. Because here's what happens. If you try to say you're just doing counterterrorism, okay, where do you get the information to go after the terrorists? Oh, yeah, and because Osama bin Laden learned not to use his cell phone and his satellite phone. And so what you have to do is get local intelligence. And the only way you get those people to work with you and then to survive the return of the Taliban the next day after you've done your quick raid and left is to stay. And so you've got to do population protection to protect your human intelligence networks, which are ultimately the only way you're effective in counterterrorism. That would be my reply. Now, again, there's a lot of room for nuance in the discussion. But my bottom line would be we tried to do a limited, narrowly defined counterterrorism for 5 or 6 years in Afghanistan, and it's what led the Taliban to have a chance to retake control in many parts of the South and East. It's what allowed them to come back. That's the second chapter of our book, How the Taliban Came Back. And I think this is the reason. We thought that counterterrorism could work on these narrow terms, but in fact, it deprived us of the kind of local population support and intelligence that we needed to go after bin Laden, to go after many of the other leaders in the area. And meanwhile, Afghanistan was falling apart, so the strategy was not sustainable. We're not going to be able to hold on to those bases from which to do the drone strikes if the government can't hold on to power. And that's the trajectory that we were on until McChrystal showed up, I would argue.
Two questions. What's to prevent a collapse once Americans leave? Mm-hmm. And why should you hope that history will not dictate that collapse?
Well, if Hasina were here, she might engage in a discussion with you about Afghan traditions politically, which of course had some elements of national unity and creation of infrastructure, very limited, but nonetheless some positive movement in the 20th century. I'll also quote for you one more quick statistic from these polls. Again, take for what they're worth, which were that Afghans were asked, what do you think of yourself as first and foremost? Are you Tajik, Uzbek, Hazara, Pashtun, local tribe, within the Pashtun community, the Papalzai tribe or the Gilzai tribe or what have you. And 61% in the last poll I saw said Afghan. And I'm sure, it depends on the day you ask and how you ask the question. And, that's probably most of us, would consider our identities to be somewhat fluid. I feel more like a New Orleans person today than I did yesterday, for example. So, yeah. Yeah, there you go. But I would say that, the bottom line is there is a certain element of national identity in Afghanistan, which is not all that strong by the standards of the globe, but it's not as weak as people allege. But the other point I would make is, no, we aren't leaving even in 2012. And this is a debate I used to have a little bit with Barney Rubin, who now works for Ambassador Holbrooke. And he used to say, we have to minimize the size of the Afghan army and police because no one is going to be able to pay for it once we leave. And my response is, why do we have to leave with that level of involvement? And you may not like my answer, and I understand where Barney Rubin was coming from, but look what happened when we kept those force levels so low. We kept NATO and the Afghan levels very low, and the Taliban came back. Pick your poison. I would rather contribute $3-4 billion a year forever to an Afghan, or not forever, but for 20, 30 years, to an Afghan state that has now become just as much of one of our key small but important allies around the world as Egypt or Israel, who also get $2 or $3 billion a year and have been getting at that level for 30 years, or Taiwan and South Korea, who did for a while. The Marshall Plan was faster, bigger, a lot more expensive, but then it was over. Afghanistan, I think, is going to take help for a long time, but I have no problem contemplating the notion of 5,000 to 10,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan for as long as they want us there, and several $billion in assistance. And at some point, those agricultural systems that we talked about hopefully will be in better shape, and that they will actually be able to support their own economy and their own security forces. But I think we're going to stay quite engaged. And by the way, the Afghans want that. The Afghans want to be part of the I'm not saying they want Americans in combat fatigues, but they do want a sense of involvement and engagement with the international community. And I don't want to overstate my knowledge of Afghanistan. I'm sure there are a lot of villagers in remote areas of Nuristan that would not agree to this. But most Afghans are increasingly cosmopolitan, future-oriented. They are internationally oriented. They are not xenophobic. And they actually welcome a certain level of international engagement. So I don't think it's going to end. What's going to end is 100,000 GIs on the territory doing the majority of the combat work themselves. That can't sustain itself, and that won't. But I don't think it's going to, in 2016, let's say if Mr. Obama were reelected as he was getting ready to leave the White House, I would predict we would still have several thousand Americans and be spending $2 to $4 billion a year on Afghanistan. And I'm fine with that compared to the alternatives.
Michael, this has been a marvelous evening. Very helpful to us.
Thank you all
so much.